California, the land of sunshine, surfboards, and some of the most twisted serial killers in American history. While Hollywood was making horror movies, these guys were out there starring in real ones. Buckle up. We're counting down the top 10 most evil serial killers from the Golden State, Part 1, based on body count, brutality, and pure nightmare fuel. Before we dive into California's worst nightmares, hit that subscribe button. It won't protect you from serial killers, but it will make sure you never miss one. Welcome to True Crime Maps. 1. Charles Ng and Leonard Lake. Leonard Lake was your average paranoid Vietnam vet, if average includes a violent obsession with sex slaves and a plan to survive nuclear war in a torture bunker. Born in 1945, he had a rough childhood and was reportedly obsessed with control from an early age. By the time he joined the Marines, he was already fantasizing about world-ending scenarios, and not in the fun, doomsday prepper way. Then there's Charles Ng, born in Hong Kong in 1960. He was spoiled, troubled, and eventually shipped off to the US, where he lied his way into the Marine Corps with a stolen ID. Shockingly, that didn't work out. He got caught stealing weapons and bailed, literally ran from military prison. A guy with klepto tendencies and zero impulse control. Perfect wingman for a serial killer, right? These two met in the early 80s through a shared love of guns, survivalist fantasies, and, unfortunately, murder. Lake had already built a secret bunker in rural Calaveras County, California. When Ng moved in, things escalated from creepy to catastrophic. Once Ng and Lake joined forces, their twisted fantasies became a full-time job. In the hills near Wilseyville, California, they set up a doomsday-style cabin, and behind it, a concrete bunker. It wasn't for canned food. It was for imprisoning, torturing, and murdering people, mostly women. Lake was the mastermind. Ng, the eager apprentice. They lured victims, often couples, under fake pretenses, killed the men and children quickly, and kept the women alive to be raped, tortured, and eventually murdered. Some were forced to act submissive on camera. They called it their Operation Miranda, based on a fictional post-apocalyptic slave girl scenario Lake had written about. Inside the bunker, police later found videotapes of the torture sessions, personal items from victims, and shallow graves. It's believed they killed at least 11 people, though estimates go much higher, up to 25 plus. Their downfall? And couldn't stop stealing. In 1985, he shoplifted a vise from a hardware store. The store owner confronted them. Lake was arrested and fled all the way to Canada. Lake swallowed cyanide during his police interview and died. Ng was later extradited after a lengthy legal battle and finally convicted in 1999. He's still on death row. 2. Richard Ramirez, Night Stalker. Born in El Paso, Texas, in 1960, Richard Ramirez grew up surrounded by violence like it was a family heirloom. His father was abusive. His cousin, an ex-Green Beret, showed him Polaroids of women he allegedly raped and murdered in Vietnam. So yeah, not exactly a warm childhood scrapbook. By his teen years, Ramirez was sleeping in cemeteries, addicted to drugs, and dabbling in Satanism. The guy wasn't just a criminal, he was a walking horror film villain. Tall, gaunt, dark hair, and that creepy, I haven't slept in a decade stare. He idolized serial killers and wore AC/DC shirts while breaking into homes. By the time he landed in Los Angeles in 1984, he was ready for his one-man crime spree. Between 1984 and 1985, Ramirez broke into homes across Southern California, sometimes San Francisco, leaving a trail of absolute horror. He didn't have a victim type. Young women, elderly men, couples, kids. He attacked whoever was unlucky enough to be home when he came creeping in at night. He'd sneak in through windows or unlocked doors, often barefoot, carrying a gun, a machete, or whatever weapon was handy. He raped, tortured, mutilated, and murdered. Sometimes he'd spare children, only to force them to watch. Other times he'd carve pentagrams into the walls or on his victims. And he loved taunting the press and police with satanic symbols and cryptic messages like "Hail Satan," subtle. In total, he was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, 14 burglaries, and that's just what they could prove. He was finally caught in August 1985, not by the cops, but by a crowd of civilians who recognized him, chased him down, and beat the hell out of him. Turns out you can only terrorize LA for so long before the neighborhood turns into a pitchfork mob. In 1989, he was sentenced to death, but he stayed alive for another 24 years on death row before dying of cancer in 2013. So, he got the slow, painful ending he probably deserved. 3. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, the Toolbox Killers. Meet Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, 2 men who met in 1978 at the California Men's Colony Prison and bonded over, casual plans to kidnap, torture, and murder teenage girls. Real wholesome bromance stuff. Bittaker was the brains, if you can call it that, a career criminal with a genius IQ and zero empathy. Norris was the follower, a known sex offender with a violent streak and absolutely no moral compass. The two clicked like duct tape on a hostage. Once they were released, they wasted no time putting their nightmare into motion. They bought a silver GMC cargo van, nicknamed Murder Mac, and outfitted it like a rolling dungeon. Inside, tools, restraints, and a mattress. Not exactly a road trip you'd want to be invited on. Their plan was horrifyingly specific: abduct 5 teenage girls in one summer, 1979, record their suffering, and kill them, all while pretending to be regular guys cruising around LA beaches, just van life things. And tragically, they did exactly that. Between June and October 1979, Bittaker and Norris abducted 5 teenage girls, ages 13 to 18, from Southern California streets, bus stops, and beaches. They lured them into their van with offers of rides, weed, or fake modeling gigs. Once inside, the horror began. Each victim was tied up and gagged, sexually assaulted repeatedly, tortured with pliers, ice picks, sledgehammers, and worse. Forced to listen to each other scream. And yes, they recorded the audio. At least one tape survived. Detectives who heard it described it as the most soul-crushing thing they'd ever experienced. Grown men vomited. One juror required therapy. It's that horrific. Their last known victim, Shirley Ledford, was abducted on Halloween night. The recording of her torture and murder was used in court, and it was so disturbing that courtroom officials had to limit how much the jury heard in one sitting. So how did these creeps get caught? Norris bragged. He couldn't help himself. He told a former cellmate what they'd done, including where a body was dumped. The guy went straight to the cops. Finally, an informant with a conscience. Norris turned on Bittaker for a plea deal. He got life with the possibility of parole. Spoiler, never granted. Bittaker, the ringleader, was sentenced to death. He died of natural causes in 2019 after 40 years of breathing air he didn't deserve. These two weren't just serial killers, they were torture hobbyists, and unfortunately, they set a benchmark for depravity that most monsters don't even reach. 4. Randy Kraft, the scorecard killer. Randy Kraft looked like someone's accountant. Clean-cut, educated, soft-spoken. He studied economics, worked in computers, and was known for being, well, boring, which is probably how he got away with being one of the most prolific serial killers in US history for years. Born in Long Beach in 1945, Kraft seemed normal on the surface, but he had dark urges bubbling underneath. By the 1970s, he was targeting young men, mostly Marines, hitchhikers, or guys leaving bars near military bases in Southern California. He had a type: clean-cut, athletic, and disposable to society's blind spots. Victims were often drugged, tortured, mutilated, and dumped like garbage off freeways. He was also methodical, meticulous, the kind of guy who'd murder you, then stop for fast food on the way home. In fact, sometimes he'd eat a hamburger with a corpse in the passenger seat. So yeah, maybe not so boring after all. When police finally caught up with Randy Kraft in 1983, they pulled him over for erratic driving on the freeway. In the passenger seat, a dead Marine. In the trunk, a bunch of drugs, a rope, and Polaroids of other men in various stages of undress or death. But the most chilling thing? A typed list of 61 cryptic entries nicknamed the scorecard. Each entry was a nickname or code that seemed to correspond to a murder. Marine Head BP, 2-in-1 hitch. Golden Sails. Jail out. Some were obvious. Others were inside jokes that only Kraft understood. But make no mistake, it was a serial killer's personal scoreboard, tracking victims like baseball stats. Investigators were stunned. While Kraft was only convicted of 16 murders, many believe the real number is closer to 67, possibly more. His victims were drugged with alcohol, Valium, or sleeping pills, bound and tortured, often with extreme mutilation, castrated or sexually assaulted post-mortem, dumped along highways or remote roads like litter. Kraft was organized, clean, and cold-blooded. He lived with a long-term boyfriend, held down a job, and blended into society while racking up a body count that could rival a small war. In 1989, he was sentenced to death, but, surprise, California's death row is slower than dial-up internet. He's still alive at San Quentin as of now, quietly aging and presumably not keeping score anymore. Randy Kraft didn't just kill, he catalogued. That level of control is what makes him uniquely terrifying. 5. William Bonin, the freeway killer. William Bonin was every parent's worst nightmare come to life. He looked like a working-class, slightly sweaty guy next door, because he was. But behind that blue-collar mask was a man who murdered at least 21 boys and young men across Southern California from 1979 to 1980. And how did he do it? In his dark green 1975 Dodge van, which became known as the Death Van. Not exactly the kind of van you want offering you a ride home. Bonin would cruise for hitchhikers or teens walking alone, often near freeways, schools, or fast food joints. He'd lure them in with kindness, sometimes cash, sometimes just a ride. But once inside the van, the doors locked, and the nightmare began. Bonin bound his victims with cords or handcuffs, raped and tortured them for hours, often strangled them with their own t-shirts or a tire iron, then dumped the bodies off California freeways like trash on a road trip. And because he hated being lonely, he often brought accomplices along for the ride. Yes, multiple. At least 4 different men helped him at various points, making it some kind of horrific murder carpool situation. Bonin's murder spree came to a screeching halt in June 1980, thanks to a good old-fashioned stakeout. Police had their suspicions and were tracking his van when they saw him pick up a 15-year-old boy. They followed and caught him in the act, assaulting the teen in the back of the van. That boy survived. What didn't survive was Bonin's secret life. Inside the van and his home, police found blood-stained mattresses, ropes, cords, and knives. Souvenirs from multiple victims. A ledger of sorts, tracking where bodies were dumped. Bonin folded under pressure and confessed to 21 murders, often in chillingly casual detail. He even bragged that murdering people became easier over time and that he preferred strangulation because it gave him more control. Truly the stuff of nightmares. He also implicated his accomplices. Vernon Butts, who committed suicide in jail. Gregory Miley, who got 25 to life. James Monroe and others who got various sentences. Bonin was sentenced to death in 1982 and, unlike many of his peers, he was actually executed. On February 23, 1996, he was given a lethal injection at San Quentin. His last meal: 2 pepperoni and sausage pizzas, 3 scoops of ice cream, and a final middle finger to humanity. Bonin is proof that sometimes evil isn't a monster under your bed. It's a dude with a driver's license and a roll of duct tape. 6. Richard Chase, the Vampire of Sacramento. If there were ever a killer who practically wore a flashing neon sign that said "Danger to Society," it was Richard Chase. Born in 1950, Chase had severe mental illness from an early age, and everyone knew it. He was obsessed with blood. He believed his own was turning to powder, and he was convinced people were trying to steal his organs. So, not exactly stable. By his early 20s, he was injecting himself with rabbit blood, blending animal guts into smoothies, and smearing raw meat on his body. His neighbors noticed. His mom noticed. But somehow, he still slipped through every crack in the system. After a short stay in a psychiatric hospital, where staff literally nicknamed him Dracula, Chase was released, because apparently no one thought a guy who drank bird blood posed a risk. Spoiler, he absolutely did. In January 1978, Richard Chase went from unhinged to full-blown predator. Over the span of just 6 days, he committed 6 murders, each one more disturbing than the last. Here's the rundown. Victim 1, a man named Ambrose Griffin, shot at random in a drive-by because Chase wanted to see what it felt like. That was his warm-up. Victim 2. A few days later, he broke into the home of Teresa Wallin, who was 3 months pregnant. He shot her, then mutilated her body, removed organs, and drank her blood. Just casually, like a deranged vampire. Victims 3. His final spree happened at the home of Evelyn Myroth, a young mother. Inside were her 6-year-old son, her friend, and a visiting baby. Chase murdered them all. The crimes were gruesome. Blood drained, body parts removed, and, yes, cannibalism. He even took the baby's body with him. Police were horrified. It wasn't just the violence, it was the ritualistic nature of the killings. This wasn't about anger or impulse. Chase believed he had to kill to survive, that his blood was disappearing, that drinking human blood would save him. They caught him quickly, thanks to fingerprints and witnesses. His apartment? Walls smeared with blood. A fridge full of body parts. No signs of remorse, just a man completely disconnected from reality. He was sentenced to death in 1980, but in 1981, before the state could execute him, he overdosed on antidepressants in his cell. Some say suicide, others say mercy, for everyone else on death row. Richard Chase wasn't just a serial killer, he was a walking psychiatric meltdown unleashed on the public by a system that failed hard. 7. Herbert Mullin, the earthquake killer. Born in 1947 in Salinas, Herbert Mullin was a bright kid with a promising future. But somewhere in his early 20s, the lights started to dim. He developed paranoid schizophrenia, became obsessed with numerology, religion, and oddly enough, the prevention of earthquakes. No, really. Mullen believed that murdering people would prevent earthquakes. According to him, human sacrifice was nature's way of keeping the San Andreas Fault calm. So when a 1972 study suggested California was due for the big one, Mullen took that very personally. He believed it was his job to stop it by killing. He started an old man he thought looked like Jonah from the Bible, then a hitchhiker, then his old high school friend, and it escalated fast. Over just 4 months in 1972 to 73, Mullen killed 13 people in Santa Cruz County. His victims included a priest, a woman and her children, random strangers walking along the road, and even campers he believed were sending him telepathic messages. What tied all the murders together wasn't method, it was madness. When Herbert Mullen was arrested in February 1973, he confessed almost immediately, not just to one murder, to all 13. And he didn't just confess, he explained in detail his reasoning. According to Mullen, every victim was a willing sacrifice. They either gave him telepathic permission or were about to cause a devastating earthquake. His killings were part of a cosmic plan to save California, which, to be clear, is not how geology or sanity works. During his trial, Mullen's defense argued insanity, and honestly, fair enough. The man believed the Beatles were speaking directly to him through song lyrics. The prosecution, however, pointed out that Mullen spaced his killings to avoid detection, hid weapons, and fled crime scenes, behavior that suggested he knew what he was doing was wrong. The jury split the difference. Convicted on 10 counts of murder. Deemed sane for those. Found not guilty by reason of insanity for the other 3. He was sentenced to life in prison, and as of today, he's still alive, somehow sitting in a cell, still claiming his murders were acts of heroism. Herbert Mullen is a tragic intersection of untreated mental illness and unchecked violence. If the voices in his head were real, they were speaking in screams. 8. David Carpenter, the Trailside Killer. David Carpenter looked like someone's awkward uncle, glasses, balding, and weirdly shy. But behind the nervous stutter was a cold-blooded killer who turned hiking trails in Northern California into hunting grounds. Born in 1930, Carpenter had a criminal record stretching back decades. He was a violent sexual offender, and prison time only seemed to harden him. By the late 1970s, he was out and back on the streets and the woods. Between 1979 and 1981, hikers began to disappear along picturesque trails near San Francisco, Mount Tamalpais, Point Reyes, and Santa Cruz. Their bodies were later found shot execution style, sometimes raped, sometimes bludgeoned, often left half buried like an afterthought. Victims included young women hiking alone, couples out for a scenic walk. In total, Carpenter was convicted of 7 murders, but he's suspected in at least 10, and many believe the number could be higher, especially since he was active during a time when multiple serial killers were operating in California. Yes, it was that bad. David Carpenter might have gotten away with it if he hadn't been such a creature of habit. Authorities were already on high alert with bodies turning up along hiking trails, and Carpenter had a rap sheet that screamed, "Take another look." His downfall started with a survivor. One couple he attacked, the man managed to escape and provided a detailed description. Police realized the man he described was disturbingly similar to someone they already questioned for a missing persons case and then let go. Oops. When they searched Carpenter's home, they found a .38 caliber revolver matching bullets used in the murders, a pair of glasses almost identical to ones found at a crime scene, and, most damning, personal items belonging to victims, tucked away like souvenirs. Carpenter was arrested in 1981. During his trial, he sat mostly quiet, showing little emotion, like a man mildly annoyed to be interrupted. He was convicted of 7 murders and sentenced to death in 1984. And just like many of his peers on California's death row, he's still alive in San Quentin, waiting and waiting and waiting. At this point, the only trail he's walking is from his bunk to the prison yard. Carpenter was a predator hiding in plain sight, quiet, forgettable, and absolutely lethal. 9. Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer. Before we even knew his name, we knew his crimes. He was the Visalia ransacker, then the East Area rapist, then the original Night Stalker. It wasn't until 2018, over 40 years later, that we finally learned he was all the same person. Joseph James DeAngelo, a former cop and full-time psychopath. From 1974 to 1986, DeAngelo committed over 120 home burglaries, at least 50 rapes, 13 confirmed murders. He started by breaking into homes to steal trinkets and terrorize women, but his methods escalated. Soon, he was raping women while their husbands or boyfriends were tied up and forced to watch. Then, he began killing them both. And he was meticulous, breaking into homes days in advance to unlock windows, unload guns, and scope out escape routes. The guy was a criminal mastermind with a police badge and a vendetta, and for years he just vanished. No fingerprints, no DNA match, just a trail of shattered families and unanswered questions. For over 40 years, Joseph DeAngelo was a ghost. The case went cold, victims grew old, detectives retired. The Golden State Killer became a cautionary tale for how evil can disappear. But then came genetic genealogy, basically 23andMe meets CSI. In 2018, investigators uploaded DNA from one of the old crime scenes into a public ancestry database, and while they didn't get a direct match, they found a distant relative. From there, it was like building a family tree backwards, trimming branches until all roads led to one man, Joseph DeAngelo. At the time, he was a retired ex-cop, living a quiet life in a Sacramento suburb. Married, grandfather, the guy watering his lawn like he wasn't a walking nightmare. Cops tailed him and eventually retrieved a tissue he threw in the trash, and a bag of dog poop, because yes, even monsters scoop after their pets. Both contained DNA that matched the killer. He was arrested in April 2018, and suddenly the boogeyman had a name, a face, and a backyard. In 2020, DeAngelo pled guilty to 13 murders, 13 kidnappings, and admitted to dozens more rapes and burglaries. He avoided the death penalty by cooperating and got multiple life sentences without parole. He's now rotting away in a prison medical facility, old, silent, and no longer feared. Joseph DeAngelo was a reminder that monsters don't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they're mowing the lawn next door. 10. Edmund Kemper, the co-ed killer. Edmund Kemper was 6 feet 9 inches tall, had an IQ of 145, and absolutely hated his mother. That last part, kinda important. Born in 1948, Kemper started showing signs of, let's say, severe problems early. By age 10, he was already killing animals and fantasizing about murder. His mother? Verbally abusive and deeply controlling. She locked him in a basement and told him no woman would ever love him. At 15, Kemper murdered his grandparents, mostly just to see what it felt like. He was sent to a state hospital for the criminally insane, and then released at 21 because he was rehabilitated. Spoiler, He was not. From 1972 to 1973, Kemper went on a murder spree around Santa Cruz, targeting female college students. He'd pick them up hitchhiking, then rape, murder, and dismember them. Heads were kept as trophies, bodies were often violated after death. And in true overachiever fashion, Kemper didn't just stop at strangers. His final victims, his mother and her best friend. He bludgeoned Mom with a claw hammer, cut off her head, and, brace yourself, used it as a dartboard. He then called her friend over and murdered her too. After murdering his mother and her friend, Edmund Kemper did something almost no serial killer does. He turned himself in. He called the police from a phone booth and calmly confessed to all 10 murders, like he was ordering takeout. At first, they didn't believe him. He had to call back and insist he was serious. Only when they found the bodies and, the souvenirs, did they realize this wasn't a hoax. What followed was one of the most bizarre and disturbing series of confessions in criminal history. Kemper gave graphic, detailed accounts of every killing. But what made it worse? His tone. He was charming, polite, even humorous. You'd think he was telling ghost stories at a campfire, except they were all true. And then came the interviews. In prison, Kemper became weirdly popular. Why? Because he was articulate, intelligent, and disturbingly self-aware. He gave interviews to psychologists, authors, and even lent his voice to audiobooks for the blind. That's right, Ed Kemper read Flowers in the Attic and Star Wars for your grandma. He's currently serving 8 life sentences in California Medical Facility, where he's still alive and occasionally requests denial of parole, because even he knows he shouldn't be let out. Edmund Kemper is the perfect storm. High IQ, zero empathy, and a deep hatred that festered for years. He's one of the most chilling killers, not just in California, but in American history. And with that, you've reached the end of the top 10 most evil serial killers in California. If you made it through all 10 of California's worst serial killers without sleeping with the lights on, congrats, you're a true crime fan. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and drop your pick for the most terrifying killer in the comments. We've got 49 more states to go, and trust me, it doesn't get prettier.